Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of Mathematically Speaking. I am Adam Allred and I will be the host of this podcast. And our first episode is is about fractals. So I'm gonna try and start all of these episodes with as few definitions as I can and a little bit of history to give you a personal context. So the first fractal that was ever made was by a man named Benoit B. Mandelbrot, and he was a a Polish mathematician who went to school in France. And he got his graduate degree back right here in California, and then went to work at IBM when they was first making their computers. So this is very, very recent mathematics. He died in 2010, and so all of his work is still kind of being moved forward. And he used these new computers to study these pictures called fractals. You can Google it real quick, and fractal geometry. If you Google that in images, it'll pop up. People thought that these were just like leftover pieces of program. They were just scattered things, and they weren't actually anything. But it turns out that they were actual mathematical things. They followed laws and other mathematical theories. And so the first one that was ever made was eventually given the name the Mandelbrot set. And a set, so first definition, a set is just a collection of things that fit under a definition. So if I'm saying it's the set of all people in the room recording with me, then I would be the only thing in that set because I'm the only one here. So what defines the actual Mandelbrot set is actually not that important. But in English, a fractal is something that repeats itself at a micro and a macro scale. So if you close your eyes don't close your eyes if you can't close your eyes, but just imagine like a circle, or if you can draw a circle. Now focus in on a piece of that circle. It's probably a line, or if you focused in on a bigger piece, a curved line. If you keep focusing in and like zooming in with your eyes, it's just a line. You don't see more circles. That's the idea behind fractals, is that when you zoom in on them, you don't just see you don't get down to a straight line. You see more of the same shape. And shapes that don't have this pattern, like a circle or a square or a triangle, belong to the world of Euclidean geometry. So the second definition, Euclidean geometry is just geometry that is normal for people, which what you take in high school. It's just generic geometry. It was made by a Greek mathematician and philosopher around 300 BC named Euclid. He wrote a book about it. Super cool stuff. But that's where what we think of geometry is Euclidean geometry, and there's lots of different kind of geometries. But the one that Mandelbrot invented was called fractal geometry. And so it's anything that it's geometry, so it studies these shapes that follow the definition of a fractal, and they can be self-repeating. So it'll be, like I said, it'll be the same shape over and over and over again, no matter how much you zoom in or how much you zoom out. So some examples of this, to give you as much of a visual as I can over an audio platform. If you imagine the Milky Way galaxy works in a spiral. It starts in the center, kind of works its way out, and that thing is called a logarithmic spiral, which I'll be getting back to later. But that same spiral, if you could zoom in on the Milky Way galaxy infinitely, it would be that same shape all the way down. You could just like crop out sections of it, and it would look exactly the same no matter how far into it you were or how far out of it you were, within reason. So given that we are in a real world, there are limitations to it, of course. You can't zoom in forever, you can't zoom out forever. So for something to be called a fractal in nature, it has to be able to, you have to be able to zoom in, quote unquote, at least 3 times. If you can do it 3 times, then it counts as a fractal. So there are examples like snowflakes. You can take a line, cut out a middle section of it, make a triangle in that section, and repeat that process over and over, and you can connect the two ends of it, and you can then have something called the Koch snowflake. So there's a little bit of history and a little bit of actual math theory. So why does it matter? All these things are largely theoretical. They're mathematical objects. A lot of them are there's a lot of them in the real world, but a lot more of them exist in a purely mathematical sense. But it matters a lot, actually, because our world is not smooth. I'm not sure if you've noticed yet, but our world is very broken and jagged and rough. It's very sharp. If you've had the pleasure of climbing a mountain, then you understand that a mountain is not a cone. Like when we all draw cones as children, it's usually just like a big cone or a big triangle on a line. That was the horizon. You're like, there's the mountain. But we know mountains aren't like that. They're very deep and involved, and they are rough. And fractal geometry is supposed to be a geometry of rough things as opposed to Euclidean, which is a geometry of smooth things. So this was Mandelbrot's entire concept when he was making this geometry, that the world is not smooth. That lightning, when it strikes, is not a straight line. It's very rough and jagged. Mountains are not cones. Clouds are not spheres. We live in a much more involved and complex world, so we should use a much more involved and complex method in analyzing it and trying to describe it. And there are mathematical ways of using Euclidean geometry, smooth geometry, to approximate things in the real world, which is in a rough and jagged world. But why have the approximation? Why not just get the exact thing? That's what Mandelbrot was trying to do. And then it was discovered that there are things that Euclidean geometry can't do. There are patterns in chemistry and physics that it couldn't solve, and so his geometry was needed to describe these patterns and the shapes that these particles were making. And they gave solved a lot of problems in the world of electromagnets, and how electrons act in those scenarios. But if you still don't care, I'm going to make it really personal for you. I want you to imagine your brain. We've all seen what a brain looks like, hopefully, on a TV, or you can Google a picture of it right now. It's 9 pounds between your ears, and it creates the world around you and perceives it simultaneously. And lately, in like the worlds of mindfulness and education, there's been a lot of talk about neuroplasticity. So all that means is that your brain can grow, and that new connections can be made, and so it means that your brain is more of a living thing in the sense that it grows and adapts to everything around it. Sorry. And because of that, evolution had a very unique problem to solve. In the early stages of human evolution, the brain was itself, and it was much smaller than it is now, and it kept growing. But if something is growing like that, it needs either a container that will grow with it, or it needs to grow a different way. And the brain, in evolution, used a fractal shape to make sure that it grew. You can think of it as growing in on itself. So if you've ever seen a picture of the brain, you see all those, it looks like they're like giant valleys. Like the brain will be growing and it'll dip in and it'll be dipping in from either side, and it's like these wrinkles everywhere. And that's because the brain is when it grows in surface area, but not in volume. The volume stays roughly the same the entire life of it, but its surface area is what can grow. So that allows it to stay in the same shape, or stay in the skull, which is not a growable container, but it can still grow inside of itself. It can still become more involved and more complex. And so if you, back when I mentioned that the Milky Way galaxy follows a logarithmic spiral, this same spiral is in the brain. That's how That's how everything kind of grows. If you look at a cross section of it, you can see the overall spiral, and you can see the multiple spirals that are within that overall spiral. Think of Inception. It's like a shape Inception. And so these patterns are what allow a lot of nature to be as effective as it can. It's definitely like it's like nature's most effective or efficient thing, because since these shapes can grow and adapt to the world around them by repeating the same process over and over again. It doesn't. You're allowed to have inefficiencies in it because it can adapt to things. And so, but it's not just our brain. It's flower petals grow in this pattern, or vegetables. If you look really closely at broccoli and cauliflower, these will be their architecture, art. But it was mathematics that let us dive deeper into what these shapes and patterns really are. And this is, like I said, relatively new mathematics in terms of considering how old math is. And it started with the Greeks, 300 BC, with geometry and Euclid. Math has had a long time to do a lot of things, and it has. And that's why a lot of people, there's a common misconception that math it's done. What we know is what we know, and we don't need to know anymore. But there's so much of the world that we don't know. And this is evidence that math is still a growing thing. So there's a lot of things that we don't know about fractals yet. There's a guy in Cornell who's making a calculus for fractals. People are trying to use them to measure dimensions of things, and there's like fractional dimensions. So we think of like, oh, we live in a three-dimensional world, or like in sci-fi, like, oh, this is a fifth dimension entity. Well, why not have it be a 3.5 dimensional thing? And so there are things like that. And so from a philosophical standpoint, if we take the math out of this and just look at like what it says in an English sense, and take any formulas that there are in there. So it's saying that life is a jagged thing. It is a rough thing, and by no means is it smooth and easy for anybody. And it seems to be chaotic. But when you take a moment to sit and look back, it also kind of seems to follow a pattern. And if you pay attention closely enough to your life, it seems like you follow the same patterns over and over, but at the time it seems like this chaotic mess that's going nowhere. But only when looking back you're able to actually focus in on see that overall shape that the chaos made. So if you want to think of it like that, you can think of your life as a fractal. But this is the great part about it, is that you can change the shape of it. If there's some behavior that's making some pattern, and that pattern is not serving you, you can change it, become a new fractal, to go from a spiral to a branching one. And so there you have it. There's a little bit about fractal geometry and and one example of why math still matters in our world, and why it needs to be talked. I think it needs to be talked about more in a daily setting. It's not just the algebra that you learn in high school. It's not just calculus. It's not just engineering. There's a lot more involved in it, and it's truly a beautiful subject. So thank you for listening. This was our first episode of Mathematically Speaking. Hope to hear from you again.